So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests involved in writing and publishing. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons get to listen to episodes of the show early and gain access to a treasure trove of bonus content that I'm regularly adding to, including over 70 bonus episodes, the TV pilot screenplay I wrote with the novel's character, and more. Please check it out at patreon.com/SoI'mWritingANovel. It has been a gosh darned minute since I've done a The Novel episode of the show. In fact, the last real one, I did a kind of a check-in in 2023 in June there, but the last real one was when I covered a story called The Gibbet, October 3rd, 2022 that went up. Obviously, my expanding my writing business into the publishing business was the main culprit behind that, and I figured it might have some kind of effect along those lines. But I haven't not been working on the novel. I have been outlining the stories taking up the final act, the last quarter of the book, and as of my saying this to you now, I've outlined absolutely everything, with the exception of the finale, for reasons I will explain. But the other stories, oh boy, I look forward to sharing them with you, the outlines, because this was definitely a very ambitious final act, and it made some of these stories take a little longer as a result. Because it's been a gosh darned minute, I'm going to do a very tiny recap of what this project even is, because maybe this is your first episode, followed by a recap of what the previous acts of the novel have been all about. If you would like to skip that and get straight to me talking about this final act overall, go to 6 minutes and 40 seconds. If you want more details, you can of course go back to the very first episode of the podcast and go from there. Untitled Sword and Sorcery Novel is a stitch-up novel, or a faux stitch-up novel, essentially me masquerading as a sword and sorcery author of many decades who wrote many short stories and is now putting them all together in linear storytelling order, if not chronological publishing order. Currently, the book is looking to have 18 stories, 17 of which are short stories, one of which is a novella-length tale. So word count-wise, we'll see how it all comes out in the end, but this is going to be on the longer side for a sword and sorcery novel, and I think that's forgivable since it's made up of independent stories that can be read in any order and enjoyed. The protagonist you'll follow through all of these stories is a big old red-haired warrior-type lady, a sort of barbarian of a northern island ever so loosely modeled after the Shetland Islands of the UK, and her name is Vo, V-O-E, Vo. The novel is broken up into 3 acts, but because of a screenwriting thingy that I carried over into this, it's really 4 quarters because the second act is split into 2 halves. In the first act, Vo becomes the first one of her people to escape their island in essentially a magical prison where they're stuck with their blood enemies in generations. And then from there, we go into the rest of the first act, which is essentially about her having been raised on stories of heroism by her blacksmith mother and color dyer, as in D-Y-E-R dyer, father, and going out into the world thinking, well, I'm going to, take care of that wizard who stuck us on this island, and I'm going to become a big hero, and that's my future. But by the end of the first act, she has become a little bit more of less of a heroic fantasy protagonist and more the sword and sorcery protagonist that we'll be following for the rest of the book. You can hear me read that first story in the act in episode 7 of this podcast, and then leap to episode 14 for a streak of episodes where each one covers, from start to finish, nuts to bolts, the outlining of one of the additional 4 stories that make up that first act. The only other thing I'll say about that act is that I intentionally set the perspective at a remove from Vo. Each of the stories is told from the perspective of somebody else whose life she comes crashing through. In the first half of the second act, the overall thing of the second act being that now Vo is no longer trying to be any kind of hero and she is living for herself. In that first half, it's kind of a riff off of Fritz Leiber's Fafford and Grey Mouser, and if you don't know who those are, don't worry about it. They're kind of like the original fantasy thief duo in a big city of thieves having wacky adventures that sometimes do have real pathos, but the tone is generally speaking pretty light compared to a lot of other S&S protagonists. Aside from it being Vo's kind of, party time years in her mid to late 20s, it's the tale of a friendship between Vo and someone else, And by the end of it, they've had a lot of experiences together, but spoiler, and of course these will always be filled with spoilers, beware, their friendship comes to an end. That's the final story in that section. And Vo goes off on her own into the second half of Act 2. In the first half, with the best friend, I do kind of a shared third-person, perspective on the two characters, on Vo and her buddy. So we get closer to Vo, but we're still kind of splitting the perspective. Going into the second half, Vo becomes something of a warlord, something of a reaver, something of a Conan type figure. I genuinely put in my notes, this is the Vonan section, ho ho ho. But certainly Conan is who I have in mind while I'm writing the stories in this section, particularly for novella long. My take, as it were, on People of the Black Circle, hands down my favorite Conan story. So yes, like Conan, she occasionally plays something of the bandit leader or warlord, and despite this, she is kind of at her loneliest. By the very end of this act, she is all alone in a bad position in that story I mentioned, the gibbet, and it leaves her at the mercy of a kind of cosmic figure that carries us forward into the third act and the fourth quarter. Jesus, I'm making this confusing for myself, but whatever. We'll just say the final act. For those of you who skipped the summary, I'll say it again. Now we enter the final act. As you can imagine, I decided upon there even being this kind of, 3 acts in 4 parts situation pretty early on in this project. But God help me, I don't know that I was ready to look back at my original denim notebook and see that the date for that page is April 4th, 2020. Ye gods. I knew this would be a very long-term project, and I'm comfortable with the choices I've made, like getting into publishing, that have ensured it will be that bit longer. But still, wow. This early in the project, I was still thinking very much about the narrative element of the wizard that trapped Vo and her people on their island, that being key in the very first story I wrote, playing more of a role throughout the book. That changed pretty dramatically, pretty quickly, but yeah, at this stage, I'm looking at the third act as I very thinly noodled it, and it's like she's entering the act with more power and knowledge and confidence, all of it there in one big ball, specifically to confront the wizard. Vo is at her peak adventuring whatever strength, and is around 30ish is what I have here, starting the whole shebang at about 19. The wizard is not encountered in the very first story in the act, but instead is kind of near the end, not quite the end, and then we have like a final story that sort of serves as almost an epilogue to sketch out, where does Vo go from here now that she's no longer adventuring type person. Pretty swiftly after this, I decided that I wanted Vo to kind of, along with the reader, forget about the wizard, not because she has a bad memory, but because life will just keep throwing things at her that will distract her, that will make bare survival the main thing. And by the time that stops being such a challenge, she'll have had, aged a few years and had her priorities realigned. That being said, it still comes back right at the very end. Nonetheless, I'm glad I did this very little thin sketch here early on in what I was calling a trajectory, after the term for it used by Ursula K. Le Guin in her excellent book, Steering the Craft, which I highly recommend, one of the few writing books I think everybody should read. As Le Guin puts it, this trajectory is the shape of the story as a whole. It moves always to its end, and its end is implied in its beginning. Though the points between changed and shifted and moved around a bit as this book developed, I'm still really glad I had that beginning of escaping the island, vowing to find and kill that wizard because of everything I've already described, and then at the very end, after having had a very rich life over the course of about 16 years of adventuring, from about 19 to about 35, Vo, for reasons, this will be explained later, of course, finds herself actually in the position to take that revenge and has to sort of be like, well, is this still something I care about? I'm so different from who I was when I set out to do this. What will it achieve? Where do I actually want to be? What will I do after I do this, assuming I can? And so on and so forth. And knowing that I had those 2 points on either end, even in a book where I'm intentionally writing it so that you can, in theory, start with any story and read them in any order and still follow what's going on and enjoy it, it affected little decisions I made along the way. Not in terms of like real, A to B to C continuity, but in terms of Vo's development. And that's not small potatoes. I mean, she's the character you're following. A few pages on in the same notebook, when I was trying to think about, like, okay, well, what's Vo going to be like in each big act of this book, I made two very teeny weeny notes for Vo, ages sort of 31 to 35. So Act 3 here. Meets the person she wants to spend the rest of her life with. Ha! Okay. Wow, sorry. As you can tell from my reaction, that changed. And note number 2, it's more important to help than to decide who is good or bad. Vo now cares about helping. That definitely changed because, yeah, like I defined her as essentially trying to be a big capital H hero in the very first act, so she cared about helping then. However, it does sort of connect to a realignment of her values, I guess, over the course of the final act, which really becomes key in one story in particular, so I'll save that for that story outline episode. After this, I didn't really do any focused work on the final act for quite some time, as you can imagine. I was concerned about the first half act. So, yeah, I'm just going to reiterate a really good notebook practice here. Always have, in my opinion, you should always have stray thoughts pages, which is what I did. So that anytime I had a thought that I just knew I wouldn't be using for a long time, a thought for the third act, I would just plunk it down in the stray thoughts pages, all of which I reviewed before it came time to sit down and really write out, okay, what is Act 3 going to be? Something I made myself wait to do until I had finished up outlining all of Act 2, both halves. I'm not surprised to see on the very first page of my figuring out Act 3 in detail, 3 quotes from Michael Moorcock. I would have had Michael Moorcock on the brain because this was September 2022 when New Age Sword and Sorcery's very first, test issue, 0, was coming out. And I had just had a very good pal be like, hey man, what if you got Michael Moorcock to be in one of the first issues that you're hoping to crowdfund in the following year? And I went, ha ha ha, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Then they said, well, here's his email. Why don't you try him out? So yeah, I found myself reviewing for the first time some of his nonfiction out of curiosity. And yeah, that gives me 3 little quotes here that informed this act. One is from Wizardry and Wild Romance, where he says, epic fantasy can offer a world of metaphor in which to explore the rich, hidden territories within us. Then on page 5 of his essay that's essentially a Tolkien teardown, epic pooh, P-O-O-H, like Winnie the Pooh, he says, the great epics dignified death. They did not ignore it. And then a little later in the same essay, he says, examine your and your audience's cultural presumptions. I could fill an hour just talking about that stuff, but I'm going to leave it there as a kind of record, and you can compare that against the results later if you so desire. So yeah, another reason I would be opening this with thoughts about Michael Moorcock and Michael Moorcock's thoughts is because as the first act is sort of Vo becoming herself, but the 2 halves of the second act are essentially, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser-ish adventures in the first half and Conan-ish in the back half. Yeah, Elric is on my mind, for this act. Not that I was seeking to make Vo really into a direct analog of him, but just I feel like this is the act where she is going to have a bit of Sturm and Drang, going to have a bit of tragedy, going to have a bit of trouble, going to have bigger, more cosmic, sorceress-infused adventures, and be kind of cursed, not with a soul-eating blade that's kind of a drug addiction analog, but with a relationship nonetheless to a superior being that really dictates her adventures. So maybe a little closer to like the patron thing that Elric has going on with Ariog. And if none of these names mean anything to you, don't worry. But it'd be ridiculous if I didn't mention them for those who are familiar. So yeah, okay. I'm in Act 3, I'm thinking about Michael Moorcock, I'm thinking about this Elric guy, I'm thinking about this idea of a supernatural patron. And that really is a huge part of this finale because at the end of the second act, the very, very end, Vo is in a bad place, as I mentioned earlier, in a story called The Gibbet. And again, spoilers, whatever, that's what this is all about. Vo is essentially going to die unless she says yes to a kind of whispering voice in the back of her mind that for a good chunk of The Gibbet, she's not even sure, is it madness, is it real, whatever. And at the end of the day, yeah, okay, it's real. It's a supernatural entity that can go and spirit her out of that cell in exchange for putting her into a more metaphorical one, the cell of indentured servitude, right? Sort of debt slavery, where Vo has a debt to this supernatural being that she has to pay off by perpetrating little missions for it all over the cosmos in all kinds of strange situations. And the trick is, of course, that in order to have the tools that she needs to do these things and in order to survive a lot of the time or be restored when survival doesn't go as well as she hopes it would, she incurs more debt. So the servitude to pay off the debt has a habit of increasing the debt. Yep, like I said, debt slavery. And that's going to be the real big thing of the act that Vo is trying to wiggle out of. Even now, with the outline basically done, I still refer to the patron simply as the patron, and rather like the idea of never actually pulling back the veil on them. So, yeah, when I refer to the patron, I basically mean something that could be a gigantic, weird, cosmic god, a devil, perhaps a wizard, perhaps the wizard, mystery, etc., etc. Just some big, powerful entity that you never see, that only Vo really can hear, and they have strange desires and wants and needs that they send Vo off to satisfy in exchange for paying off a portion of her debt. Ho, ho, ho. And so this became the first sort of checklist item for each story in this act. You see, I wanted to build a checklist of things that would be not like story elements necessarily, although the patron thing is, I guess, but just like, you know, how do I really give this act a coherent feeling, a coherent voice, and make it substantially different from the previous acts while still feeling logically like something that would flow out of them? And so, yeah, the patron thing, right? It's kind of like how every single story in the very first act, we would have a different character that would be watching Vo through, and that was kind of a first, act necessary checklist item. So in this, we always have to be like, well, what is the patron sending her to do? Even if we never really entirely learn why it did that, and we have to just infer it from her actions, Vo has to have some kind of mission from the patron. One thing that helped me build this checklist was doing a thorough re-review of every page of my notes practically before this. I strongly recommend it because even though it may feel redundant, even though it may, for me, bring up the ghost of the still very much living and healthy Ryan North, who unintentionally planted a terrible thing in the back of my mind when he mentioned to me one time long ago the phrase wasted keystrokes, an artifact of learning Dvorak or whatever the heck, different ways of typing there are. And now it's like I go to another room and I leave, and then I realize I forgot something I went into that room to get, and my brain just whispers like, wasted keystrokes, wasted energy, you'll be dead soon, and you'll have wasted so much time and energy, oh god. But yeah, I don't consider it wasted keystrokes to go back and review your notes before going into any big portion of a project, because in the reviewing, you end up doing revising and realizing, okay, you're looking at it now through the eyes of you at this stage in the project, not the eyes of you earlier when you first wrote those things. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I need to explain this in great detail, but just, yeah, don't punish yourself if you feel the need to go back and re-review your old notes. It's a very healthy thing to do. Aside from all kinds of little bits and pieces along the way, I was reminded that I had more or less chosen the 5 stories I wanted to have in this act in the broadest of senses of just like, well, what kind of like weirdness do I want to experiment with here and there? So, one of the stories I knew for sure I wanted to take place deep underground. Another story I knew I wanted it to be kind of a zone story. So kind of something like Stalker or Annihilation, essentially a story about, what if there was an area where the normal laws of physics and nature and what have you were suspended, but in ways that appear to those out, don't understand it, to be random, capricious, etc. But there's some reason to go in there that's compelling enough to risk it. And I love the idea of that taking place in kind of a medieval setting, since the only zone stories I'm familiar with are all very science fiction. I'll talk more about that when I get to that episode. I also like the idea of doing a Sword and Planet story, and I had some thoughts that I actually eventually abandoned. I'll talk about that more later as well. Blending it with a kind of very German story called a Heimkehr, which is basically like a story about soldiers after a war who don't know what to do with themselves. And at this point, I thought one of the stories was going to be kind of Vo hopping back through time to be on the island she had escaped at this point where she would have been like a little girl. And I had all kinds of notions about that, but ultimately that story got canned. And finally, a story which I had done a little tiny bit of outlining for called Stairs, which, yeah, sorry, I'm going to say this a lot at this point. I'll talk about more later. But that is the finale. That is the, okay, now she's going to confront that wizard and we're going to wrap this book up story, Stairs. As I was reviewing all these old notes, by the way, I was putting down just enough to understand what the hell I was referring to, along with a page reference in this part of this notebook. So building a short list of reference, specifically of the things in my old notes that referred to Act 3 going forward. So yeah. Once I had done that, I kind of thought about it a little bit. And I was like, all right, there's some neat stuff here, but is there like a pattern? You know, I mentioned Moorcock, but I don't know that I'm trying to invoke him as much as with Howard or Liber in the past two, quarters or whatever there. A little, maybe not as much. The question, what is weird, capital W weird, feels like a core component of this quarter. Also, I find myself pondering, Vo's arc to living for continuing process, something I've discussed in past episodes, which puts her at odds with the wizard's constant quest for creating a kind of perfected community, right? Because I had eventually come across the idea that what he did to her people on that island was an experiment along the lines of how do you make an ideal community. His ideas of ideal being kind of strange, but anyway. There'd also be the tension of Vo's quest to escape debt to her patron. And then I thought about the idea of her literally carrying a carrier bag with her, collecting little tchotchkes in it, one from each adventure that is kind of a mnemonic device reminding her of something key that she learned, likely to do with the thematic statement or conflict of that story. And that bag is essentially how she maintains her hope for a future after servitude. A life beyond being a sword and sorcery hero who fights and kills things often to resolve their issues. So yes, plainly a very direct line to the carrier bag theory of fiction, which I explain and read completely in its entirety for you in episode 6 of this podcast. I knew I wanted the concept of culture shock to be important in this. If we're going to be sending her out to weird, strange places, I mean, they better be weird and strange, right? And also another little sort of Le Guin thing sneaking in there, as that was something she did a lot in her fiction. I like the idea of Vo as an implacable intruder, making her kind of alien to the people she encounters as much as they are to her, and being just like, yeah, the peak of her capabilities in terms of being a mighty warrior, but what does that do to you, And then the arc, the journey, the trajectory, whatever, of just this act, aside from her quest to escape debt, I suppose, would be Vo seeking redemption from the events of the story Vo Loses It, the second last tale, where she sacrifices someone for treasure, and a very different kind of decision to the one she makes at the beginning of the second act, where she saves a friend to, and says, the heck with it, to the treasure that she has to abandon in order to do that. Already, this may seem like a lot, right? Especially for something I'm building out of short stories. But this is why, I don't know, to me, it's like, you can have big ideas and you can have big arcs and big progress and just nudge each of it forward just a little bit in a way that matters, is impactful, but is not a big chunk of any given individual story, and just have it kind of slowly accrete over the course of several. So by the time the character really does reach somewhere that's so different from where they were at the beginning, it feels natural and less okay, well, this is the adventure where they learn how to share. And then they act 3 of that story, they have figured out that sharing is good. Okay, that's that story. And then we move on to the next one. And their ability to share is taken care of. Now it's I want all these things gradually building over the course of many stories. It makes character growth a little more subtextual, which I prefer, as I feel that's a little truer to life. And also more manageable for me to write. Now, a big checkmark list, decision for this act is, what about point of view, right? I mentioned how in the very first act, we're at a kind of remove from Vo, we're seeing her through other people's eyes. First half of the second act, we get a little closer, but we kind of share her perspective with her friend. Then the third, why did I do this to myself? The second half of the second act, so the third quarter, it's not full on first person, it's still third person limited kind of, but it's over her shoulder with the occasional omniscient sheet. So, closer still. Well, we can only get closer, I feel, by this final act. So we're going to be looking through her eyes first person. Oh yes, which is a perspective that a lot of people have trouble with for Sword and Sorcery. I'm not sure why, especially because Sword and Sorcery definitely had like some hard-boiled elements put into it by good old Robert E. Howard. So it was, a sibling of that genre at its heyday. And that genre was all about first person. So yeah, why can't you have a hard traveling hero telling you their thoughts first person? I think nowadays people associate that way more with like YA adventure kind of stuff or coming of age stories around teenagers, young people. It provides this immediacy, really gets you in the heads of their problems. And I'm just thinking, well, why not do that for this? Especially because I really want you as the reader to experience Vo's feelings, experience Vo's displacement and feeling of strangeness and loneliness and all that really tightly. So yeah, all right, first person it is. Something else I've thought as I've worked on this project is how does Vo's voice evolve? And up until this point, that's really just been a question of dialogue. But if it's going to be first person POV, then that's everything. That's the prose, that's the dialogue for her. Yeah. So I did a page of just thinking about like how she sounds, and it was kind of nice to revisit that because I thought about it at the beginning of each portion of the book, but to think about it having outlined all of them, well, let's say review, right? It allows you to see things you didn't see the first time around. As I saw it while making these notes, in Act 1, Vo is younger, her least traveled, most naive self, wanting to be a hero, swinging between awkward and too intense, unsure, and yet the world is black and white, damn it. Sometimes has broken quote-unquote English to the ear of the POV characters, especially in the earlier tales when she's still figuring out some of the languages of the mainland, and sometimes leads to an amusing or dark malaprop. Okay, first half of the second act, when she's having fun in the city with her best friend. Confidence is found, getting better at languages, show-offing her delayed, kind of early 20s brashness, enjoys cheerfully deploying new slang, but sometimes her old unsureness resurfaces, very sociable and flirty. Okay. Second half of the second act, her Vonan days, well, she's now a supremely confident loner masking the hurt of her broken friendship. Now an experienced polyglot a la Conan, a true traveler with legends, truisms, and so forth from many locales to draw upon when relating ideas to others. Okay, cool. So how about this final act? I would say pretty similar to the previous one, but now she's struggling to see the end of a weird and terrible servitude and to see anything beyond it. So definitely like a more mournful, kind of just like, oh boy, sounding voice. Not that I want to write a character who is very passive and just moans and groans all the time. Just, she's in a tough place, and the way she takes in the world is reflected by that. The last thing that I did before the final part of prepping for Act 3 was to think about thematic statements or conflicts, the conflict being just like a question that can be resolved many, 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 many ways, as opposed to the statement, which is a direct statement, right? I was thinking about this because I was kind of concerned that in my getting lost in the granular level of this big, big, big outline project, that I might end up unintentionally repeating myself. It's kind of a horrifying thing when that happens. I once wrote in 2 consecutive years 2 screenplays that ended with big showdowns in surgeries, and I didn't realize it till it was way too late, and it was the worst. So yeah, I thought it'd be a good idea at this point to just review what each story I had outlined was fundamentally saying. And it was kind of interesting, actually, to see what arose. Luckily, I didn't have anything quite like that double surgery climax situation. But yeah, let's rattle through them real quick. In the very first story, Vo, you have to change if you want to grow. Second story, the woman who floated through time. It's better to seek knowledge for the collective good than to hoard it for personal gain. Followed by monstrously slow. We can lose it through our actions, but we don't have to earn our humanity with deeds or raw ability. Next story, the boy and the blacksmith. Telling a story about what you want won't make it true. Now, the final story of the first act, Disgrace the Stone, I was stunned to find I had no real direct statement. It's kind of all about how authority can use the concept of heroism and hero worship to justify sacrificing others for their own benefit. So, yeah, I don't know if I have... It's just kind of a statement. I'm going to leave that in for now as what that story is about. I feel quite happy with it. Onward to Vaux's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser days with kinship in Koltum. The statement there being that loyal, open, and honest friendship is the most important thing. Pretty straightforward, classic thing to say, but, I'll be brave, I'll say it. Next story is Sacred Thievery. Faith in other people is more important than faith in gods or the unknown. Then we have Flighting Fancy. We create and care about meaning. Nothing else does, certainly not the cosmos, and that's fine. That's not what the cosmos does. And then the final story for that act, Carry Me from Koltum. As you go through life, you can't take everything with you. All right. Act 2, Part 2, the Vonan days. In My People, I went with a thematic conflict. I like the idea of each character in that being a different way of exploring the same question, different way of answering it. And that question was, how do you choose between practical need and impractical dream? Classic thematic conflict. The next story was Vaux Loses It, with the statement, sometimes how we choose to protect ourselves hurts us most of all. And then the final story, before we get into Act 3, the gibbet. Perfection, real or imagined, is a prison from which only change will set you free. Ha! A variation on the first thematic conflict. I'm okay with that, though. I'm okay with that. Doesn't feel like it's saying exactly the same thing precisely, and it feels like a good place structurally to revisit that theme, given that in the very first story, it's all about Vaux having to change, to grow, to escape the island, and then lo and behold, in the gibbet, her idea of having perfected herself, being the ultimate cool adventuring life, etc. This is all I need, goddammit, has imprisoned her in the gibbet. Yeah, no, I'm okay with that. I like that. Made me feel good. Made me feel good about the project as a whole to see, my big ideas for each story reviewed and put them all down on 2 pages, each one highlighted in a different color, because you got to do that, baby. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's wrap this episode of the podcast up with the very, very last thing I did before progressing into outlining the first story of the third act, which was to just quickly pass my eyes back again over everything I had written down for my overview of Act 3 and my past checklists for past portions, quarters, acts, half acts. Oh my God, why did I do this to myself? Of the book, the previous quarters of the book. So for this, I felt like, okay, what's my checklist? Item number 1. I need to know what goes in Vaux's carrier bag and what it is meant to remind her of. What is her takeaway, essentially, from this adventure? Second checklist item, how is she turning from seeing herself as attempting to have stasis to seeing life as a continuing process that never really stops evolving? Next one, the patron debt tug of war. How does that evolve? Next one, how does Vaux's attitude toward killing evolve from where it was earlier to it's a chore is kind of where I want her to wind up. That being picked from the carrier bag theory of fiction. How does the big cosmic horror of it all affect Vaux? That was important to me. I didn't want Vaux going through each of these stories, seeing the most terrifying, god-awful things I can come up with, and being like, yep, whatever. I'm a protagonist. Next up, how does this story re-enchant the world? Right, so I talked about this in previous episodes, this idea that I love, where in a sword and sorcery story, ideally you can re-enchant the world, which is to say, bring a sense of awe and wonder to it, whether that's through something positive or through some kind of, say, cosmic horror. Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a happy, smiley thing. Just making the world and the universe feel big and wonderful and awe-inspiring. Yeah. How does Vaux reclaim agency through nurturance? Yes. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in one of the story outlines, so I'm going to leave that unexamined for now. Next one, where is the culture shock? Then just make sure POV is first person, what is the thematic conflict, and then sort of sub-checklists like me working through Brian Murphy's Sword and Sorcery checklist, the 7 points of commonly encountered things in Sword and Sorcery Tales, and Le Guin's sort of, things that you can do in a story that aren't conflict. Which I think sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but boy, the way we're all taught to write stories, so often it's like there is nothing but conflict. If it's not conflict, it's not story. So yeah, I find that list is a good one to go through as a kind of checklist, as a kind of writing prompt thing. Yeah. All right. So that's my big checklist. Pretty long, huh? But you know what? It's interesting. I thought I would only be checking it at the end of stories, but more than once I found myself working through it, as I say, more like a prompt thing, early or even halfway through the outline. Anyway, we'll get into that with the next episode, which is all about a story that, at least for now, is called Inner Sea. So I'm Writing a Novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you soon. Little side confession. God, I wish I could sing. I really, really wish I could sing, and if I had money to burn, I would take singing lessons, knowing that I would never be great, but maybe I could at least get something out of myself that every once in a while wants to come out and results in some pretty embarrassing noises.